In 2001, I was a brand new shiny daughter planning to save the world. My first job was working for 3 months on a lung cancer unit. Nearly all of my patients were smokers or ex-smokers, and most of them had started smoking when they were children or in their early teens. And despite living in a beautiful, wealthy country with access to the most sophisticated medicines, nearly every single one of my patients died. Everyone knows tobacco is bad, but when you see the impact firsthand, day by day, it leaves a very deep impression. 10 years later, I am a radiation oncologist, fully aware of the suffering caused by tobacco. I'm sitting at a hospital cafeteria, having my first ever meeting with a representative from my superannuation fund. It was thrilling. I'm sure you can imagine. He tells me I'm in the default option, and I said, "Options? Does that mean there are other options?" He looked at me, rolled his eyes, and said, "Well, there is this one greeny option for people who have a problem with the interesting in mining alcohol or tobacco." I said, "Did you just say tobacco?" He said, "Yes." I said, "So are you telling me I'm currently investing in tobacco?" And he said, "Oh, yes, everyone is. When you invest in a company, you own part of that company. You want that company to grow and succeed and thrive. You want that company to attract new customers. You want that company to sell more of its products. And when it comes to tobacco, I couldn't think of anything that I wanted less. Now, I know you can only see one person standing here on this big red dot, on this enormous stage, but instead, I would like you to imagine that you are looking at 7 million people crammed up here beside me today. 7 million people across the world have died as a result of tobacco in the past year alone. Just imagine if a brand new industry were launched today, and by the end of last June, that industry's products had killed 7 million people. Would any of us invest in that new deadly industry? Tobacco is one of the most pressing global issues for our time, and most of us are far more complicit in the problem than we may realize. So, the Superfund representative explained to me that tobacco companies would be found in the international shares portion of my portfolio. So I asked him, "Well, which international share do I have?" He got back to me 2 weeks later with this list. My number one holding in the international shares was British American Tobacco. Number two, Imperial Tobacco. Number four, Philip Morris. And number five, the Swedish Match Company. Four of the top five companies were tobacco companies. My investments and encouraged. And then I realized it wasn't just me, it was all members of my super fund. And then I realized it wasn't just my super fund, it was all of them. And then I realized it wasn't just superannuation funds, it was banks, issuers, and fund managers. And then I realized it wasn't just Australia, it was the entire global finance sector, completely tangled up with the tobacco industry. The industry that makes products that kill 7 million people every year. So I started discussing the issue with my superannuation fund, and I've been discussing it ever since. Finance leaders have many challenging issues to deal with these days. So I suggest they adopt a framework that clearly articulates why it is reasonable to take a strong position on tobacco. I suggest finance leaders ask a series of three questions of any company in which they might invest our money. Question 1. Can the products made by the company be used safely? No is the answer for tobacco companies. 0 is the only safe number for cigarettes for a human being. It could not be more black and white. Question 2. Is the problem caused by the company so significant on a global level that it is subject to a UN treaty or convention? Yes, is the answer for tobacco. Indeed, there is a UN tobacco treaty that has been ratified by 180 countries. The treaty was created because of the catastrophic global impact of tobacco. The current forecast is that the world is on track for 1 billion tobacco-related deaths this century. 1 billion deaths. There is only 7 billion of us. Question 3 relates to the concept of engagement. Many financial organizations genuinely want to be good corporate citizens. They want to use their shareholder power to sit down with companies, engage with them, and encourage them to do better things. So the question is, can engagement with the company be an effective lever for change? No is the answer for tobacco companies. Engagement with the tobacco industry is for trial. The only acceptable outcome would be if tobacco companies ceased their primary business. In fact, engagement with the tobacco industry has never led to less human death. When we consider that framework, three simple questions, we can see that it is reasonable and defensible to take a strong position and exclude investment in the tobacco industry. In addition to the UN Tobacco Treaty, there is, in fact, another global treaty that demands that we act on tobacco. In 2015, the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. Now we are talking about tobacco, and I know you are going to jump straight to number 3, good health and well-being. And indeed, ramping up tobacco control regulation is essential if we are going to achieve that goal. However, look a bit more deeply, and you will find that 13 of the 70 goals cannot be achieved unless there is a major shakeup of the tobacco industry. Personally, my favorite goal is number 17, partnerships for the goals. At present, we have the entire global health sector doing everything it can to help the tidal wave of patients suffering as a result of tobacco. But that said, in the past year alone, 7 million people have died, so clearly there's not enough. We also have governments allied on tobacco, 180 of them, busy trying to implement the provision of the UN Tobacco Treaty, but that too is not enough. If the global finance sector continues to lend money to tobacco companies, to invest in tobacco companies, and to strive to profit from tobacco companies, we are working against each other. Now, if we are going to disrupt what doctors call the global tobacco epidemic, we lead every sector of society to stand side by side and be part of the solution. So I call on finance leaders to implement a framework to deal with sensitive issues, and I call on them to uphold global conventions, but in addition, there are business risks, pure financial risks associated with being invested in the tobacco industry over the long term, and I ask finance leaders to consider them. The first risk is that fewer and fewer people will smoke as a result of increasing tobacco regulation. When these warnings were put on cigarettes packaged in Canada, tobacco can make you impotent. The first response of smokers who to give them right back to the salespeople and said, "Could you please just give me the ones that say they'll kill me?" Regulation gets noticed. Regulation reduces consumption, and we have 180 countries committed to more regulation. Let's talk about litigation and the risk that presents. At present, it is the business model of the tobacco industry that is being challenged. Currently, the tobacco industry externalizes all of the health costs associated with tobacco. Government pays, communities pays, you pay, I pay. The tobacco industry externalizes all those costs with an estimated $1 trillion per year. Yes, they internalize and privatize the profits. In 2015, in Quebec province, the cost determined that the tobacco industry was indeed responsible for those health costs and ordered them to pay 15 billion US dollars. That case is under appeal, but it begs the question, why should any of us in any country be paying for the cost of the tobacco industry? Let's move on to supply chain and the risk there. It is not well known that the tobacco industry significantly relies on child labor. In March 2017, the International Labour Organization issued a report which states in tobacco growing communities, child labor is rampant. The U.S. Department of Labor currently lists 16 countries that use children to produce tobacco leaf. Scrutiny of supply chains is intensifying, and that cannot continue to escape public attention. Finally, there is also reputation risk to consider for individuals and organizations that continue to maintain an affiliation with the tobacco industry. In Connor's surveys, the tobacco industry ranks as the world's least reputable industry. Let's just look at the impact on children. Globally, every single day, it is estimated that 100,000 children start smoking. That's enough children to fit inside a Melbourne cricket ground, and most of those children are from the poorest communities on earth. Here is Australia. The average age that people start smoking is 16 years and 2 months. They look pretty young to me, but the worst thing here is that while we don't have data from every country on earth, we believe that is the oldest age. Everywhere else is younger. Now for the good news. Things are changing. The finance sector is coming to the party. After around 2,000 meetings with finance leaders, primarily in the cafes of Melbourne and Sydney and London and Paris and New York and all across the globe, momentum moving away from investments in the tobacco industry is starting to snowball. Finance leaders are alarmed when they are presented with the facts, and overwhelmingly, they want to be part of the solution. Here in Australia, we now have 10,636,000 101 superannuation accounts. That's a tobacco fee. That one is mine, by the way. There is still a lot of work to be done, but I've watched the conversation go from should we go tobacco free to why haven't we done it yet? In the past year alone, major tobacco free moves have been made by leading financial organizations in 8 different countries in Australia, New Zealand, and Netherlands. Sweden, Denmark, France, Ireland, and USA by sovereign wealth funds, fund managers, pension funds, banks, insurance, and reinsurers. Since tobacco-free portfolios began, more than $6 billion has been withdrawn away from more than $6 billion has been withdrawn away from investments in the tobacco industry. The case study is well and truly proven. When making the tobacco-free announcement in March this year, the CEO of AMP Capital said, "We are not prepared to deliver investment returns at any cost to society." And that is the question we need to ask ourselves. Is there no baseline standard below which we will not think to make profits? Along the way, I've had a lot of help and incredible support. Now, if you're trying to do something, I highly recommend that you have a princess on your team. Her Royal Highness Princess DM is the global ambassador for this work. We also have a law alive, a former premier, a former premier, a former federal minister, and a stack of CEOs. But the capacity to change things does not rest exclusively. But the capacity to change things but the capacity to change things does not rest exclusively with these highly influential people. The power to do that is with all of us. Everyone here can be part of the solution. In fact, everyone here must be part of the solution. Most people in this room own companies while their superannuation funds, their banks, and their insurance, and it is time for us to ask them, are they investing our money in companies that make products that kill 7 million people every year? It is your money, it is my money, it's our money, and that is a very reasonable question. Pretty cramped up here with 7 million people beside me today, but if we don't act now and act together, we'll need to make way for 1 billion people before the end of this century. And this is a very high stage. And this is a very big stage, but there is no more room.